For centuries, it was nothing more than legend. A city mentioned in the Quran destroyed by God for its arrogance and greed. Iram of the Pillars, the Atlantis of the Sands, a place so magnificent that it became synonymous with hubris, so thoroughly erased that skeptics dismissed it as pure myth. Explorers searched for it. Scholars debated its existence. The desert kept its secrets. Then, in the early 1990s, satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above Earth detected something buried beneath the world's largest sand desert. Ancient tracks converging on a single point, invisible to the human eye but clear in radar imagery. A team of archaeologists followed those tracks into the empty quarter, into one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet, and found ruins that would rewrite our understanding of ancient Arabia. This is the story of Ubar, the lost city that God destroyed, and how NASA found what explorers sought for 1,000 years. The Quran describes it with reverence and warning. Surah Al-Fajr verses 6 through 14. Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with Ad, Iram of the Pillars, the likes of which had never been created in the land, and Thamud, who carved out the rocks in the valley, and Pharaoh, owner of the stakes, all of whom oppressed within their cities and caused much corruption therein? So your Lord poured upon them a scourge of punishment. Indeed, your Lord is ever watchful. Iram of the Pillars, a city built by the ancient people of Ad, a civilization that flourished in southern Arabia thousands of years before the birth of Islam. According to Islamic tradition, these people were giants, builders of monuments, masters of architecture who constructed towers and pillars unlike anything the world had seen. Their city was wealthy beyond measure, positioned along the frankincense trade route that connected Arabia to the Mediterranean world. Caravans bearing precious resins worth more than gold passed through Iram, enriching the Ad people, feeding their pride. But pride, as the story goes, became their downfall. The prophet Hud came to them, calling them to worship God alone, to abandon their arrogance and greed. The people of Ad refused. They mocked the prophet. They believed their wealth and power made them invincible, that their city would stand forever regardless of divine will. So God sent punishment. Not armies, not plague, but nature itself. A sandstorm rose from the desert, winds so powerful they buried the entire city overnight. When the storm cleared, Iram was gone, swallowed by sand, erased from the earth as if it had never existed. Only the legend remained, passed down through generations, a warning about the fate of those who forget humility. For over 1,000 years, Iram existed primarily in religious texts and oral tradition. Medieval Islamic scholars debated whether it was real or allegorical. Some believed it was literal history, an actual city destroyed as the Quran described. Others argued it was metaphor, a spiritual lesson rather than geographical fact. The city appeared in other sources as well. The Arabian Nights mentions it as a place of lost treasure and divine judgment. Medieval Arab geographers placed it somewhere in southern Arabia, in the region called Al-Akaf, the sand dunes. But nobody could say exactly where. Nobody could prove it had ever existed at all. Western scholars who encountered the legend in the 19th and early 20th centuries were equally divided. Some saw it as Arabia's equivalent of Atlantis, a mythological city representing a lost golden age. Others believed there might be historical basis, that the legend preserved memory of some real settlement that had been abandoned or destroyed. The challenge was evidence. The empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali, was largely unexplored by Western expeditions. Crossing it was dangerous, often fatal. Finding archaeological evidence in that vast ocean of sand seemed impossible. But the legend persisted, and with it the tantalizing question, what if Iram was real? What if, buried somewhere beneath those dunes, the remains of the city actually existed, waiting to be discovered? The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, one of the most hostile environments on the planet, a desert so vast and inhospitable that it has remained largely unchanged by human activity for millennia. 650,000 square kilometers of sand stretching across Oman, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. To call it merely big fails to capture the reality. It is an ocean of sand, dunes rising to heights of 250 meters, wind-sculpted formations that shift and change with every storm. There are no permanent human settlements in the interior. No cities, no towns, barely any vegetation. Just sand, heat, and silence. The climate is as extreme as the geography. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, hot enough to make metal untouchable, hot enough to kill an unprotected human in hours. At night, especially in winter, temperatures can drop to near freezing. The temperature variation is brutal, a daily cycle of baking heat and bitter cold that cracks rocks and warps any structure that tries to endure it. Rainfall is negligible, sometimes absent entirely for years. When rain does come, it falls in brief violent storms that create flash floods in the wadis, the dry riverbeds, before disappearing into the sand as quickly as it arrived. Navigation is nearly impossible without modern technology. The dunes all look the same, endless repetitions of sand ridges and valleys with no landmarks, no fixed points of reference. Sandstorms can rise without warning, reducing visibility to zero, burying tracks, reshaping the landscape overnight. Compasses work, but they only tell you which direction you're going, not where you are or where you need to be. Before GPS, crossing the empty quarter meant following stars at night and hoping you had calculated correctly. Mistakes were fatal. Entire caravans disappeared into this desert, swallowed without trace. And yet, for thousands of years, people crossed it anyway. Not for pleasure, not for exploration, but for profit. Because on the southern coast of Arabia, in the mountains of Dhofar in modern Oman, grew trees that produced one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world: frankincense. Frankincense is a resin, extracted from boswellia trees by making cuts in the bark and allowing the sap to harden into aromatic chunks. In the ancient world, it was essential for religious ceremonies, burned as incense in temples from Egypt to Rome, used in burial rites, valued for its medicinal properties. The demand was enormous and constant. Egyptian pharaohs sent expeditions to obtain it. Roman emperors paid fortunes for regular supplies. And the only place it grew naturally in large quantities was southern Arabia. The frankincense trade created one of the earliest long-distance commerce networks, routes stretching from Dhofar north through Arabia to the Mediterranean, east to Mesopotamia and Persia, west to Africa. Caravans of camels, hundreds of animals in single trains, carried loads of resin across thousands of kilometers. The journey was dangerous and expensive, which made the commodity even more valuable. By the time frankincense reached Rome or Alexandria, it was worth more per ounce than gold. And somewhere along those routes, according to legend, stood Ubar, a waypoint, a fortress city, a place where caravans could rest and resupply before continuing the dangerous crossing of the empty quarter. If you were traveling from Dhofar to the north, you would need water. You would need shelter. You would need a location that was reliably accessible despite the shifting sands. Ubar, if it existed, would have served that function. A city built on geography and commerce, enriched by its position on the frankincense route, dependent on the water sources that made survival possible in the desert. But the empty quarter is unforgiving. Settlements require water, and water in the desert is rare and unreliable. Springs dry up, underground aquifers deplete. Climate change over centuries can transform fertile areas into sterile waste. If Ubar was real, and if it was destroyed as the legend claimed, the desert would have reclaimed it quickly. Sand buries everything. Winds erase structures. Within a few generations, an abandoned city could disappear completely beneath the dunes, leaving nothing visible on the surface. This was the challenge facing anyone who wanted to find Ubar, searching for something that might not exist, in a desert that hides everything, with no clear idea where to look. The odds were overwhelmingly against success. Most rational people would have given up before starting. But some people aren't rational, some people are obsessed. The first Westerner to seriously search for Ubar was Bertram Thomas, a British civil servant and explorer who served in Arabia during the 1920s and 1930s. Thomas had a gift for languages and a fascination with the interior desert that most British officials never ventured into. In 1930, he became the first European to cross the Empty Quarter, traveling from Salalah in Oman to Doha in Qatar, a journey of over 1,600 kilometers through territory that was unmapped and largely unknown to Western geography. During his crossing, Thomas encountered Bedouin tribes who had lived in and around the Empty Quarter for centuries. They told him stories, oral histories passed down through generations, about places that no longer existed. One of those places was called Ubar. The Bedouin described it as a great city of old, destroyed by God for its wickedness, buried beneath the sand. They spoke of ruins they had seen in certain areas, pottery shards and fragments of buildings half covered by dunes. Thomas found some of these artifacts himself, ancient pottery scattered across the sand, evidence that people had once lived in areas that were now completely barren. Thomas became convinced that Ubar had been real, that it was more than just legend. He published his findings in 1932 in his book Arabia Felix, describing his journey and his conversations with the Bedouin. He called Ubar the Atlantis of the Sands, a romantic name that captured Western imagination even as it made scholars skeptical. Atlantis, after all, was myth. Calling Ubar by that name suggested it might be myth as well. Other explorers followed Thomas's route or made similar journeys. Wilfrid the Siger, perhaps the greatest desert explorer of the 20th century, crossed the Empty Quarter twice in the 1940s, traveling with Bedouin companions, living as they lived, documenting a way of life that was already disappearing. The Siger also heard stories of Ubar, also saw pottery fragments in the sand, but he never found the city. None of them did. The desert was too big, the evidence too sparse, the technology too limited. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, referenced Ubar in his writings, though he never searched for it himself. The legend had captured the imagination of everyone who spent time in Arabia, who heard the stories and wondered if beneath all that sand, some truth remained. By the 1970s and 1980s, most archaeologists had concluded that if Ubar existed at all, it was probably not a single city but a regional name for multiple settlements along the frankincense route. The legend was likely composite, combining memories of several different places into one mythological location. Finding a specific Ubar was probably impossible and perhaps unnecessary. The frankincense trade was well documented in other ways. Ancient texts mentioned various Arabian cities involved in the trade. Physical evidence of the trade existed in ports and marketplaces across the Mediterranean and Middle East. Whether one particular city called Ubar had existed seemed academically interesting but not crucial. Then Nicholas Clapp got involved, and everything changed. Clapp was not an archaeologist. He was a documentary filmmaker based in Los Angeles, someone who made his living telling stories rather than digging up artifacts. But he was fascinated by Ubar, had been since the early 1980s when he first encountered the legend while researching frankincense for a potential documentary. The idea of a lost city buried beneath the Arabian desert appealed to him on every level. It was romantic, mysterious, potentially filmable if it could ever be found. More than that, Clapp genuinely believed it was real. He read everything he could find about Ubar, studied medieval Arab geographers, examined Ptolemy's ancient maps of Arabia, talked to everyone who had ever written about the frankincense trade. What Clapp noticed was that ancient sources consistently placed Ubar, or cities that might be Ubar, in the same general region, the southern part of the Empty Quarter in the area of Dhofar, somewhere between the coast and the interior desert. Ptolemy's geography, written in the 2nd century CE, mentioned a place called Amenum Emporium in approximately that location, described as a major trading center. Medieval Arab maps showed routes converging in southern Arabia. The Bedouin oral traditions Thomas had recorded all pointed to the same general area. Clapp developed a hypothesis. If Ubar had been a major stop on the frankincense route, then ancient caravan tracks would lead to it. Multiple routes would converge on the city from different directions, like spokes on a wheel hub. If those routes could be found, they would point directly to where Ubar had stood. The problem was that in the empty quarter, caravan routes were invisible. Sand had covered them centuries ago. You could walk across an ancient trade route and never know it. But what if you could see through the sand? In the 1980s, NASA was developing synthetic aperture radar for the Space Shuttle program, advanced imaging technology that could penetrate cloud cover, vegetation, and even sand to reveal geological features beneath. The radar worked by sending signals from orbit that bounced back differently depending on what they encountered. Dense materials like rock returned stronger signals than loose materials like sand. Buried structures, ancient riverbeds, geological formations invisible to normal photography would show up clearly in radar imagery. Clapp had an idea. What if NASA could image the empty quarter with this technology? What if buried caravan routes, compressed sand and gravel from centuries of camel traffic, would show up in the radar returns? If they did, those routes could be mapped, and wherever they converged, that would be Ubar. It was audacious. It was borderline crazy. Clapp had no academic credentials, no institutional backing, no reason to think NASA would take him seriously. But he was persistent. He wrote letters, made phone calls, contacted everyone he could find who might help. He needed three things: NASA's cooperation to get radar imagery, an archaeologist with credentials to give the project legitimacy, and permission from a government to actually conduct an expedition in the empty quarter. The archaeologist came first. Dr. Juris Zarins, and professor at Southwest Missouri State University, specialized in Arabian archaeology and had worked in the region for years. Zarins was intrigued by Clapp's idea, recognized that it might actually work. Radar imaging had been used successfully in other archaeological applications, revealing ancient Mayan cities under jungle canopy, finding buried Roman roads in North Africa. The technology was proven. Applying it to the empty quarter was logical. Zarins agreed to join the project and brought academic credibility. That helped secure NASA's cooperation. The space agency agreed to provide radar imagery from previous shuttle missions that had imaged the Arabian Peninsula. They had data covering the empty quarter that had never been analyzed for archaeological purposes. Clapp and Zarins could have access to it. The third element was more complicated. The empty quarter spans multiple countries, and conducting archaeological work requires permission from host governments. Saudi Arabia was difficult to access for foreign researchers. The UAE was possible but bureaucratically challenging. That left Oman, specifically the Dhofar region in the south, which happened to be exactly where Clapp thought Ubar would be found. Oman in the 1980s was ruled by Sultan Qaboos bin Said, who had modernized the country and was supportive of archaeological research. Zarins had contacts in Oman from previous work. Permission was granted. The final piece was the expedition leader, and for that they recruited someone with impeccable exploration credentials. Sir Ranulph Fiennes, the British explorer who had led expeditions to both poles, crossed Antarctica on foot, circumnavigated the world along its polar axis. Fiennes knew desert travel, knew logistics, knew how to organize and execute expeditions in hostile environments. He agreed to lead the ground team that would follow wherever the satellites pointed. In 1990, the team assembled in Oman. They had satellite coordinates, ground-penetrating radar, GPS navigation technology that was just becoming available for civilian use, and the conviction that they were about to find something extraordinary. The radar imagery from NASA had revealed what they hoped for: ancient tracks beneath the sand, visible only in the processed radar returns, converging from multiple directions on a single location near a village called Shisr in the Dhofar region. Shisr was known to the local Bedouin. There was a well there, an ancient water source still producing water, and some ruins that everyone assumed were from an old fort. Nobody had investigated it thoroughly. It was just a small site in a region that had thousands of small archaeological sites, most of them unexplored. But the satellite imagery suggested something more. The convergence of routes was unmistakable. Multiple ancient tracks, compressed trails that showed up in radar because the sand there was denser from centuries of traffic, all leading to Shisar. The team arrived at the site in February 1991. From the surface, it didn't look like much. There was the well, a rectangular hole lined with stones, still producing clean water after thousands of years. There were some ruins, walls, and foundations visible above the sand, the remains of what appeared to be a small fortress or fortified building. The local Bedouin called it Shisar and knew it had been there for a very long time, but they had no specific legends about it being Ubar. This was just an old place with water, one of many scattered across Arabia. But when they began excavating, what they found suggested this was far more significant than a simple desert fort. The walls they uncovered were substantial, built from limestone blocks, carefully fitted together, 8 towers arranged in an octagonal defensive perimeter. This had been a fortress, a fortified structure designed to protect against attack and to control access to the water source. The architecture was sophisticated, showing knowledge of defensive engineering and construction technique that required organized labor and considerable resources. As they dug deeper, they found multiple layers of occupation. This site had been inhabited not once but many times over thousands of years. The lowest layers dated to around 2800 BCE, the Bronze Age, showing that people had recognized the value of this water source since the dawn of civilization in Arabia. Above those ancient layers were remains from the Iron Age, then from the Classical period when the frankincense trade was at its height, then from late Roman and early Byzantine periods. Pottery fragments, tools, animal bones, storage containers, evidence of continuous or repeated habitation spanning 4,000 years. But the most dramatic discovery was geological rather than archaeological. The entire fortress, all 8 towers and the walls between them, had been built directly over a massive limestone cavern. The cavern had been created by water erosion over millions of years, groundwater dissolving the limestone bedrock, creating a void beneath the surface. The ancient builders either didn't know the cavern was there or knew and built anyway, perhaps because the water source was too valuable to abandon. At some point, probably around 300 to 500 CE based on the dating of the most recent occupation layers, the cavern's ceiling had collapsed. The entire fortress had fallen into the earth, a catastrophic structural failure that would have been sudden and destructive. Anyone inside when the collapse occurred would have been killed instantly or trapped beneath tons of rubble. The sinkhole that remained was visible on the surface, a depression partially filled with sand and debris, surrounding the well that somehow had survived the collapse. When the team realized what they were looking at, the implications were immediate. A city that had fallen into the earth, swallowed by the ground beneath it, destroyed catastrophically and abandoned. This matched perfectly with the Quranic description of Ubar's destruction. The legend said God had sent a sandstorm, but perhaps the reality was geological. Perhaps the divine punishment was actually sinkhole collapse, a natural disaster that to ancient observers would have seemed supernatural in its suddenness and totality. The artifacts they recovered told the story of Ubar's economic importance. Pottery fragments from across the ancient world, Roman amphorae, Syrian storage jars, Greek trade goods, Persian ceramics. This had been an international marketplace, a place where goods from multiple civilizations changed hands. They found frankincense burners, bronze implements specifically designed for burning resin, some still containing residue that chemical analysis confirmed was frankincense. They found weights and measures, tools for commerce, evidence of a sophisticated trading economy. Carbon dating and pottery analysis allowed them to construct a timeline. The site at Shisar had been occupied first in the early Bronze Age, probably as a seasonal camping site near the reliable water source. By the Iron Age it had become a more permanent settlement with defensive walls. During the height of the frankincense trade, roughly 300 BCE to 300 CE, it had grown into a substantial fortress controlling the water source and the trade routes that passed through. Then sometime around 300–500 CE, the catastrophic collapse occurred. The fortress fell into the sinkhole. The survivors, if there were any, abandoned the site. The trade routes shifted to other locations. Shisar was forgotten, buried by sand, lost to history except in legend. In December 1992, the team announced their findings. Headlines around the world proclaimed, "The Lost City of Ubar Found." National Geographic published an extensive article. Television documentaries were produced. Nicholas Clapp wrote a book about the expedition titled The Road to Ubar. The story had everything: ancient legend, modern technology, dramatic discovery, a mystery solved after centuries of speculation. But almost immediately the debate began. Was Shisar really Ubar, or had they found something else? The case for identifying Shisar as Ubar was compelling. The location matched ancient descriptions, situated in southern Arabia along the frankincense routes. The convergence of caravan tracks visible in satellite imagery suggested this had been a major waypoint, a place where multiple routes intersected. The water source was critical, the only reliable well for over 150 kilometers in any direction, which would make it invaluable for caravans crossing the empty quarter. The archaeological evidence confirmed continuous occupation during the exact period when the frankincense trade was most active. The catastrophic sinkhole collapse matched the legendary description of sudden destruction. Local Bedouin oral tradition associated the name Ubar with this general region. The combination of evidence seemed overwhelming. Dr. Juris Zarins, the expedition's archaeologist, was cautiously supportive of the identification. He noted that Shisar fit the profile of what Ubar should be: a fortified trading post positioned to control water and trade routes, destroyed by sudden catastrophe, abandoned and forgotten. The physical evidence was consistent with the legend in every major detail except one: scale. The Quranic description of Iram of the Pillars suggested something grand, a city of monuments and towers. Shisar was a fortress, substantial but not monumental. Where were the great pillars? Zarins and others proposed that Iram of the Pillars might not refer to architectural columns, but to natural stone formations common in southern Arabia, tall limestone pillars created by erosion that the ancient people might have incorporated into their understanding of the city's identity. Or perhaps the pillars were the defensive towers of the fortress, 8 substantial structures that would have been impressive to anyone approaching from the desert. The poetic language of the Quran was not necessarily meant to be literal architectural description. But skeptics raised significant objections. First, the size problem. Shisar was a fortress, not a city. The ruins suggested a population of perhaps a few hundred people at most, concentrated in a defensive structure. This didn't match the legendary descriptions of Ubar as a great city, a place of wealth and splendor. If Ubar was Arabia's Atlantis, shouldn't it be bigger? Second, the name. No inscriptions had been found at Shisar identifying it as Ubar or Iram. The local Bedouin called it Shisar, not Ubar. While Bedouin tradition associated the name Ubar with this region, that didn't definitively prove this specific site was the legendary city. Ubar might have been a regional name referring to multiple settlements along the trade route, not a single location. Third, the multiplicity problem. Archaeological surveys of southern Arabia had identified dozens of similar sites, fortified structures built around water sources along the frankincense routes. Many of them showed evidence of catastrophic abandonment. Several had been destroyed by sinkhole collapse or other geological events. Shisar was significant, but it wasn't unique. What made it Ubar rather than just one of many trade route fortresses? Fourth, the timing. The final collapse of Shisar occurred around 300–500 CE based on archaeological dating, but Islamic tradition placed the destruction of Ubar in pre-Islamic times, centuries earlier, during the period of the Prophet Hud, who lived long before Muhammad. The dating didn't quite match. Of course, legends often compress time and oral traditions aren't precise about chronology, but it was another inconsistency. Some scholars argued that Ubar wasn't a single city at all, but rather a culture or a region. The people of Ad mentioned in the Quran might have occupied a broad territory, building multiple settlements, and the legend of Ubar's destruction might combine memories of several different catastrophes into one mythological event. In this interpretation, Shisar was certainly part of the Ubar culture, but not the only site that deserved the name. Dr. Zarins himself acknowledged these complications. In interviews and academic papers following the discovery, he was careful to say that Shisar was likely one of several Ubars, rather than definitively the Ubar. He pointed out that the frankincense trade network included numerous fortified way stations, that any of them could have been called Ubar by travelers using different routes or speaking different dialects. The name might have been generic, like calling any major trading post marketplace, rather than using a specific proper name. The geological evidence was perhaps the most interesting aspect. The sinkhole collapse at Shisar was dramatic and catastrophic, exactly the kind of event that would enter legend as divine punishment. Imagine experiencing that collapse if you were living in or near the fortress. The ground would have shaken. Massive sections of wall and tower would have fallen into a suddenly appearing chasm. The sound alone would have been terrifying. To ancient people without geological understanding, it would have seemed supernatural, an act of God rather than natural process. But geologists studying the site determined that the collapse didn't happen overnight. The limestone cavern beneath Shisar had been unstable for centuries. There were multiple small collapses over time, each one causing damage that was repaired. The fortress rebuilt on the same location because the water source was irreplaceable. The final catastrophic collapse was just the largest in a series, the one that finally made the site untenable. This process of gradual instability followed by catastrophic failure had taken place over hundreds of years, possibly longer. This didn't match the Quranic description of sudden punishment, a sandstorm that destroyed the city in a single night. But perhaps that detail was poetic compression, legendary simplification of a longer process. Or perhaps the legend preserved only the final collapse, the dramatic end, while forgetting the earlier cycles of damage and repair. Modern consensus among archaeologists and historians is nuanced. Shisar was certainly a significant site on the frankincense trade route. It was fortified, well-positioned, continuously occupied for thousands of years, ultimately destroyed by dramatic sinkhole collapse. It matches many elements of the Ubar legend and is probably the best candidate we have for a physical location associated with that legend. But it was almost certainly not unique. The frankincense trade network included many similar fortresses and way stations. Ubar likely referred to multiple places or perhaps to a region rather than a single city. The legendary Ubar, the Iram of the pillars described in the Quran, was probably composite, combining memories and stories from multiple locations into one mythological place that became shorthand for hubris and divine justice. Shisar may have been one of the primary inspirations for that legend, perhaps even the main one, but we cannot say with absolute certainty that it was the only place called Ubar, or that it was the specific city the Quran describes. And perhaps that ambiguity is appropriate. Perhaps legends aren't meant to be pinned down to exact coordinates and carbon dates. Perhaps the power of the Ubar story lies not in its geographic specificity, but in its moral message, its reminder that wealth and power are temporary, that nature and God are more powerful than human pride. What the discovery at Shisar tells us, regardless of whether we call it Ubar, is that the legends had basis in reality. There were great cities in ancient Arabia. The frankincense trade was vast and sophisticated. Catastrophic destructions did occur, natural disasters that seemed supernatural to those who experienced them. The empty quarter, despite its modern emptiness, was once traversable and inhabited. Civilization rose and fell there just as it has everywhere else, following the same patterns of growth and decline driven by economics and environment. The frankincense trade itself is a window into the ancient global economy. For over 1,000 years, this single commodity connected Arabia to the Mediterranean world, to North Africa, to South Asia, to East Africa. Roman emperors depended on regular supply of frankincense for religious ceremonies. Egyptian temples burned it daily. Persian royal courts used it in burial rites. The demand was enormous and constant, and meeting that demand required complex logistics, long-distance transport, secure trade routes, fortified waypoints, and the kind of international cooperation that we often assume is a modern invention. The trade was lucrative enough to support the construction and maintenance of fortresses like Shisar across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. It was valuable enough that people risked crossing the empty quarter, risked death by dehydration or sandstorm, or getting lost in the featureless dunes, because the profit margins justified the danger. And when the trade finally declined, when Christian Rome reduced its consumption of frankincense, and when maritime routes replaced overland caravans, the fortresses were abandoned, the wells fell into disuse, and the desert reclaimed the land. Climate change played a role as well. The empty quarter wasn't always as empty as it is now. Geological and archaeological evidence shows that southern Arabia experienced periods of increased rainfall during the late Stone Age and early Bronze Age, times when the region was more hospitable, when vegetation was more widespread, when travel was easier. As the climate dried over subsequent millennia, the desert expanded, water sources became more scarce, and the already difficult crossing of the empty quarter became nearly impossible. By the time of the late Roman period, around 300–500 CE, when Shisar was finally abandoned, the region was approaching its modern climate state. The water table had dropped. Springs that had flowed for centuries were drying up. The underground aquifers that fed wells were being depleted. Maintaining settlements in the interior desert was becoming unsustainable. The final collapse of Shisar's fortress may have been geological, but the decision not to rebuild may have been economic and environmental. Why invest in reconstructing a fortress at a location where water was failing and trade was declining? This interplay between human activity and environmental change is part of what makes the Ubar story relevant to modern concerns. We live in a time of rapid climate change, of shifting rainfall patterns and declining water resources, of desertification affecting regions around the world. The story of Ubar, of a civilization that thrived and then failed as water disappeared and climate changed, is not just ancient history. It's a preview of challenges we face now. The moral dimension of the Ubar legend also remains powerful. The Quranic account emphasizes that the people of Ad were destroyed not merely because of natural disaster, but because of their arrogance, their refusal to heed warnings, their belief that wealth and power made them invincible. This is a cautionary tale about hubris that transcends any specific religion or culture. Every civilization that has risen has eventually fallen, often because the very success that made them powerful also made them complacent, arrogant, unwilling to adapt to changing circumstances. Whether you interpret the story of Ubar religiously as divine punishment or scientifically, as the predictable result of environmental and economic factors doesn't change the fundamental lesson. Civilizations that overextend themselves, that depend on unsustainable resource extraction, that ignore warning signs of impending collapse, tend to fail catastrophically. The geological destruction of Shisar, the sinkhole that swallowed the fortress, is perfect metaphor for that kind of collapse. The ground beneath seemed solid until it wasn't. The fortress seemed secure until it fell. Today, Shisar is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized officially as the Land of Frankincense, along with several other archaeological sites in Oman that were part of the trade network. Tourists can visit the ruins, see the fortress walls and towers, peer into the sinkhole that destroyed the settlement, draw water from the well that still flows after 5,000 years. The Omani government has built a small museum nearby displaying artifacts from the excavations and explaining the site's history. The local Bedouins still tell stories about Ubar, still maintain oral traditions passed down through generations. Some of them work as guides for tourists, sharing the legends their grandfathers told them, connecting modern visitors to ancient memory. The tradition hasn't been broken, just transformed, finding new relevance in new contexts. The well at Shisar is perhaps the most poignant element of the site. It's not large, not impressive architecturally, just a rectangular hole lined with stones, a opening into the aquifer below. But water still flows into it, still collects in the basin, still provides life in the midst of the desert. For 5,000 years, through multiple civilizations, through rise and fall and abandonment and rediscovery, the water has continued. Everything else changed. The fortress collapsed. The trade routes shifted. Kingdoms rose and fell, but the water endured. There's poetry in that endurance, a reminder that nature operates on timescales longer than human history. The aquifer that feeds the Shisar well was formed millions of years ago by rainfall that percolated through limestone bedrock during wetter climatic periods. The water flowing today fell as rain tens of thousands of years ago, filtered slowly through stone, collected in underground reservoirs, and now emerges into sunlight serving the same function it served when Bronze Age travelers first discovered it. Long after the last human has forgotten Ubar, after the ruins have completely eroded, after even the legends have been lost, that water will still be seeping up from the deep places, still creating an oasis in the emptiness. The debate about whether Shisar is truly Ubar will probably never be completely resolved. We don't have definitive proof, no inscription saying "Welcome to Ubar" in ancient South Arabian script. We have evidence that strongly suggests this was a major site on the frankincense route, that it was catastrophically destroyed, that it matches many elements of the legend. For some people, that's enough. For others, uncertainty remains appropriate, caution about making claims that go beyond what evidence strictly supports. Perhaps the most honest answer is this: Shisar is as close to Ubar as we're ever likely to find. It's the place where legend and archaeology most clearly overlap, where the stories told by ancient texts and the evidence excavated from the ground come closest to alignment. Whether it deserves the name Ubar depends partly on how you define that term, what you believe the legend represents, what standard of proof you require. For believers, for people who approach the story from a religious perspective, Shisar provides physical confirmation that the Quranic account has historical basis. The fortress existed. It was destroyed catastrophically. It stood along the frankincense routes in exactly the region where tradition placed Ubar. That's validation of faith, proof that the sacred texts describe real places and real events even when conveying spiritual lessons. For skeptics, for people who approach from a purely archaeological perspective, Shisar is one interesting site among many, significant but not unique, probably not the single location that inspired all the legends. The evidence suggests a network of trade centers rather than one legendary city, a regional culture rather than a specific place. The legend, in this view, is composite fiction built from fragments of history. Both perspectives have merit. Both are defensible based on the evidence, and perhaps both can coexist without contradiction. Religious truth and historical truth aren't always the same thing, don't always operate by the same rules. A legend can be spiritually true, can convey important moral lessons, can be worthy of belief and reverence, even if its historical details are embellished or compressed or combined from multiple sources. And a historical site can be genuinely significant, genuinely worthy of study and preservation, even if we can't prove it matches exactly with a specific legendary location. What matters most, perhaps, is that the search for Ubar succeeded in revealing something important about the ancient world and about ourselves. The empty quarter, which seemed to have erased all traces of past human activity, actually preserved those traces beneath its sand. The legends, which seemed like pure myth, actually contained accurate geographical and historical information passed down through oral tradition across dozens of generations. The technology we developed for space exploration, for studying other planets, turned out to be useful for understanding our own planet's past. And the human drive to explore, to solve mysteries, to find answers to ancient questions proved strong enough to overcome enormous logistical challenges and skeptical dismissal. Nicholas Clapp, the filmmaker who started this quest, wasn't supposed to succeed. He had no credentials, no institutional support initially, no rational reason to think he could find what professional explorers had sought for decades without success. But he was stubborn, convinced, willing to pursue an obsession that most people would have abandoned as unrealistic. That stubbornness, combined with new technology and collaborative teamwork, led to discovery. The story of finding Ubar is almost as compelling as the story of Ubar itself. It's a reminder that important discoveries don't always come from expected sources, that amateur enthusiasm combined with professional expertise can achieve things neither could accomplish alone, that the most interesting questions sometimes require unconventional approaches. If Clapp had been a traditional archaeologist, he might never have thought to approach NASA about satellite imagery. If Zarins had been solely responsible, he might not have prioritized searching for a legendary city over more conventional archaeological projects. The combination of perspectives, the filmmaker's vision and the archaeologist's rigor, made the discovery possible. Ranulph finds brought yet another essential element, the practical knowledge of how to actually conduct an expedition in one of the world's most hostile environments. Desert exploration isn't just about having coordinates and equipment. It's about logistics, about water and fuel management, about navigation when GPS fails, about reading weather and terrain, about knowing when to push forward and when to retreat. Those skills, accumulated over decades of extreme expeditions, were crucial for getting the team safely to Shisar and back. The interdisciplinary nature of the discovery is worth emphasizing. This wasn't just archaeology. It was archaeology plus satellite remote sensing plus exploration experience, plus local knowledge from Omani guides, plus geological expertise to understand the sinkhole, plus ceramic analysis, to date the pottery, plus historical research into ancient trade routes plus linguistic work on place names and legends. Modern archaeology increasingly works this way, integrating multiple disciplines and technologies, because complex questions require complex approaches. And there are more questions to answer, more mysteries buried beneath the empty quarter. Satellite imagery has revealed numerous other sites, ancient structures and routes visible only from space, scattered across the desert. Most have never been excavated, never been studied. Who built them? When? What happened to the people who lived there? How many other Ubars might be waiting to be discovered? Climate change might actually accelerate these discoveries. As global temperatures rise, as weather patterns shift, the empty quarter is experiencing changes. Some areas are receiving slightly more rainfall than in previous decades, enough to support more vegetation, which stabilizes dunes and makes archaeological features more visible. Other areas are experiencing more intense sandstorms that expose buried structures. The desert is dynamic, constantly changing, and those changes occasionally reveal what has been hidden. There's also the possibility of more advanced remote sensing technology. Ground-penetrating radar has improved dramatically since the 1990s. LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to create detailed topographical maps, can penetrate vegetation and sand to reveal structures invisible to normal observation. Drone surveys make it possible to systematically image large areas that would take weeks to cover on foot. Machine learning algorithms can analyze satellite imagery to identify potential archaeological sites by recognizing patterns that human observers might miss. All of these technologies could be applied to the empty quarter, could potentially identify sites that would make Shisar seem small by comparison. But technology alone isn't enough. Archaeological discovery requires funding, institutional support, government permission, trained personnel, time, and patience. The empty quarter spans multiple countries with different political situations, different attitudes toward foreign researchers, different levels of archaeological infrastructure. Some areas are accessible, others are not. Some governments encourage archaeological research, others are indifferent or actively opposed. The political and bureaucratic challenges are often greater than the technical ones. There's also the question of whether we should excavate everything we find. Modern archaeology increasingly recognizes that excavation is destructive, that once you dig up a site, you've changed it irrevocably, removed it from its context. Sometimes the most responsible choice is to document a site's existence, protect it from looting and development, but leave it unexcavated for future generations who will have better technology and more advanced methods. Not every archaeological site needs to be, or should be fully excavated. In the case of Shisar, excavation was appropriate because the site was already partially exposed and vulnerable to natural erosion and human interference. Documenting it thoroughly, recovering artifacts that would otherwise be lost, understanding its history and significance, all of that justified the excavation. But there are probably dozens or hundreds of similar sites scattered across the empty quarter where excavation would be premature, where simply knowing they exist and protecting them is sufficient for now. The Ubar story also raises interesting questions about how we remember history, how civilizations preserve or lose knowledge of their past. The legend of Iram survived for over 1,000 years through oral tradition and religious texts, preserving enough accurate information about location and trade routes that modern researchers could use it to find actual ruins. That's remarkable continuity of memory across enormous spans of time. But most of what the people of Shisar knew about themselves was lost. We don't know what they called their city. We don't know their stories, their beliefs, their fears, their daily lives except through the fragmentary evidence of pottery and building foundations. They left no written records, no inscriptions. Everything we know about them is inference based on physical remains. They were illiterate, or if they could write, they wrote on materials that didn't survive, or they simply didn't bother recording their history because they had no reason to think anyone in the distant future would care. This is the fate of most human history. The vast majority of people who have ever lived left no records, no trace except occasional artifacts that archaeologists might find centuries or millennia later. Even the minority who do leave records, who write things down or carve inscriptions, usually aren't preserved. Documents decay, monuments erode, languages become extinct, and knowledge is lost. The fact that we remember anything at all about the ancient world is the exception, not the rule. Thousands of cities have been built and abandoned. Thousands of civilizations have risen and fallen, and we know nothing about most of them except that they existed. Ubar survived in memory because it became a moral lesson, because its story served a purpose beyond simple historical record. The Quran preserved it as example of divine justice, as warning about the consequences of arrogance. That religious significance kept the story alive when purely secular history would have been forgotten. Whether or not the Quranic account is literally accurate in every detail, its preservation of the legend ensured that some memory of these ancient trade cities survived into the modern era. This intersection of faith and history is sensitive territory. Religious believers and secular scholars sometimes approach questions like, was Ubar real? From incompatible starting points, with different standards of evidence, different assumptions about what constitutes truth. Archaeological findings can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on your prior commitments. For believers, Shisr might be definitive proof of the Quran's historical accuracy. For skeptics, it might be merely interesting correlation between legend and reality that doesn't prove anything supernatural. But most people probably fall somewhere in between those extremes. Most people can appreciate that legends often contain kernels of historical truth while also being embellished and mythologized over time. Most people can accept that religious texts serve primarily spiritual purposes while also sometimes preserving accurate historical information. The discovery at Shisr doesn't force anyone to choose between faith and science. It can be understood and appreciated from multiple perspectives simultaneously. What the discovery does force us to confront is our own assumptions about the past. We tend to assume that ancient peoples were less sophisticated than us, less capable, less knowledgeable. The reality is more complex. In some ways, they were less advanced. They lacked our technology, our scientific understanding, our accumulated knowledge. But in other ways, they were remarkably sophisticated. They built trade networks spanning continents without modern communications. They navigated across deserts and oceans without GPS. They constructed buildings and fortifications that survived thousands of years. They adapted to and thrived in environments we find barely habitable. The people who built and maintained Shisr were intelligent, resourceful, knowledgeable about their environment in ways we've largely forgotten. They understood water sources, desert navigation, camel husbandry, trade negotiation, defensive architecture. They developed techniques for preserving food, for protecting themselves from heat and cold, for finding their way across featureless terrain. They created a functioning economy in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. That deserves respect and recognition, not condescension. And they failed ultimately. The fortress collapsed, the trade routes shifted, the settlement was abandoned. But failure is also part of the human story. Every civilization eventually fails. Every city eventually falls or is abandoned. Rome fell. The Maya cities were abandoned. Angkor Wat was swallowed by jungle. Easter Island civilization collapsed. This pattern repeats throughout history, and it will continue repeating. Our own cities, our own civilizations will eventually fail as well. That's not pessimism, it's simply recognition of how history works. Nothing human is permanent. But that impermanence doesn't make human achievement meaningless. The people of Shisr built something significant, created value and meaning in their lives, contributed to the larger story of human civilization even though their specific settlement eventually failed. Their fortress is gone, their names forgotten, their language extinct. But they were here. They lived. They mattered to each other and to the larger networks of trade and culture that they were part of. And now, centuries later, we remember them again, reconstruct fragments of their story, honor their achievement by studying their ruins. Perhaps that's the best we can hope for. To live meaningfully, to create something of value, to contribute to human civilization in whatever way we can, and to trust that even after we're gone, even after our works have crumbled and our names been forgotten, some trace of what we did will survive. Some future generation will find our ruins and wonder about us the way we wonder about Shisr. The empty quarter is still empty, still hostile, still one of the least hospitable places humans have ever tried to inhabit. But it's no longer a complete mystery. We've pierced its secrets, found what it was hiding, proven that emptiness is recent, that life and civilization once flourished where now there is only sand. That knowledge changes how we see the desert, transforms it from a place of absence to a place of buried memory, an archive waiting to be read by anyone with the technology and determination to do so. And somewhere out there, beneath dunes that shift and reform with every storm, beneath sand that has accumulated over millennia, there may be other sites, other fortresses, other cities waiting to be discovered. Perhaps there really was a city grander than Shisr, a Iram of the pillars that more closely matches the legendary descriptions, still buried, still hidden, still keeping its secrets. Perhaps the great discovery hasn't happened yet. Perhaps the true Ubar, if such a place exists as a single identifiable location, is still out there. Or perhaps Ubar was never meant to be found, was always meant to remain mysterious, a legend that inspires more through absence than through presence. Perhaps the search matters more than the finding, the quest more than the destination. Perhaps trying to pin Ubar down to exact coordinates and carbon dates misses the point, reduces something mythologically powerful to something archaeologically mundane. There's value in mystery, in not knowing everything, in leaving some questions unanswered. A world without mysteries would be a world fully mapped and documented, with nothing left to discover, nothing left to wonder about. That would be a diminished world. The fact that we can still debate whether Shisar is Ubar, can still argue about what the legends mean and what the archaeological evidence proves, suggests that some mystery remains, that the story isn't completely closed. The desert keeps its secrets even as it reveals them. For every site we discover, for every question we answer, new questions emerge. The more we learn about ancient Arabia, the more we realize how much we don't know, how much has been lost, how fragmentary our knowledge really is. That should inspire humility, awareness of the limits of our understanding, recognition that the past is never as fully knowable as we might wish. But it should also inspire continued effort, continued searching, continued attempts to recover what we can of human history. Every archaeological discovery, every translated inscription, every analyzed artifact adds something to our collective knowledge, fills in one more piece of the enormous puzzle of human history. The discovery at Shisar added significant pieces. It confirmed that the frankincense trade was real and extensive, that fortified settlements existed deep in the empty quarter, that catastrophic collapses happened and became legendary, that satellite technology can find what conventional exploration missed. Future discoveries will add more pieces, will refine our understanding, will perhaps settle questions that remain open now. But they will also raise new questions, reveal new mysteries, remind us that history is infinitely complex and that any attempt to fully understand the past is necessarily incomplete. For now, we have Shisar. We have ruins that can be visited, artifacts that can be studied, evidence that can be analyzed and debated. We have a legend that has been partially confirmed, partially complicated, made simultaneously more real and more mysterious by archaeological investigation. We have a story that connects ancient Arabia to modern technology, that bridges religious faith and scientific inquiry, that demonstrates both the power of human curiosity and the limits of human knowledge. The city that God destroyed was real. It stood in the empty quarter, controlled trade routes, drew water from an aquifer that still flows, built walls that still stand in ruins. And it was found, discovered through combination of ancient legend, modern technology, and human determination to solve mysteries and answer questions that have lingered for centuries. Whether you call it Ubar or Shisar or simply the fortress at the old well, the place exists. You can go there. You can stand at the edge of the sinkhole and imagine the moment of collapse, can draw water from the ancient well and taste what Bronze Age travelers tasted, can touch walls that have stood for thousands of years in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. That physical connection to the past, that ability to touch the same stones touched by people who lived and died millennia ago, is part of what makes archaeology powerful. History becomes tangible, stops being abstract dates and names in textbooks, becomes real places and real objects that you can see and touch and try to understand. The empty quarter stretches endlessly in every direction from Shisar, sand dunes rolling toward distant horizons, emptiness that seems infinite. But it's an emptiness that conceals rather than contains nothing. Beneath those dunes, history sleeps, waiting, patient, ready to reveal itself to anyone determined enough to look, equipped with the right tools, willing to brave the heat and the isolation and the danger. Somewhere out there, the Atlantis of the sand still exists. Whether it's another fortress yet to be discovered, or whether Shisar itself deserves that romantic name, or whether the true Ubar is something we'll never find, something that exists only in legend and faith, and the collective memory of a civilization that's been dust for 1,500 years. That question remains open. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some mysteries should stay mysterious. Perhaps some cities should remain lost. Perhaps the desert should keep some of its secrets. But the search continues. It always does. Because humans are curious creatures, explorers by nature, unable to leave questions unanswered or mysteries unsolved. We'll keep looking, keep excavating, keep analyzing satellite imagery and following ancient roots and trying to separate legend from history. And maybe, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Rub al-Khali, something is waiting to be found that will make the discovery at Shisar seem like a footnote, will rewrite our understanding of ancient Arabia completely, will prove that the legends were more accurate than we ever imagined. Or maybe Shisar is all there is. Maybe the legends were always more fiction than fact, more poetry than history. Maybe the search for Ubar says more about us, about our need for mystery and discovery and connection to the past, than it does about ancient Arabia. Either way, the story matters. The legend endures. And in the empty quarter, where the wind never stops blowing and the sand never stops shifting, the ruins stand. Silent witnesses to a civilization that rose and fell and left behind just enough evidence to make us wonder, just enough mystery to make us search, just enough questions to keep the story alive across centuries and continents and the vast distances of time. The desert remembers, even when we forget, even when memory fades and cities crumble and languages die and cultures disappear. The desert remembers. And occasionally, when we ask the right questions and look in the right places, and refuse to accept that some things can never be known, the desert reveals what it remembers. Shisar stands at the edge of the empty quarter, ruins half buried in sand, a well that still provides water after 5,000 years. It's a small place, easy to miss, barely visible on the landscape. But it represents something larger than itself. It represents every lost city, every forgotten civilization, every mystery that makes us wonder about the past and our place in the long chain of human history. We found Ubar, or we found something close enough to Ubar that the distinction barely matters. We proved that the legends weren't entirely fiction, that the ancient world was more sophisticated than we assumed, that faith and science can both approach truth even if they don't always agree on what truth looks like. And in doing so, we proved something else, that curiosity matters, that persistence pays off, that some questions are worth pursuing even when the odds of success seem impossibly long. Nicholas Clapp didn't have to search for Ubar. Nobody asked him to. Nobody believed he would succeed. But he did it anyway because the question fascinated him, because the mystery demanded an answer, because somewhere deep in human nature there's a drive to explore and discover that can't be suppressed. That drive built Ubar in the first place, led ancient people into the empty quarter despite its dangers, created trade networks that spanned continents, made civilization possible in places where survival seemed impossible. And that same drive brought us back, millennia later, to find what had been lost, to remember what had been forgotten, to prove that nothing is truly erased as long as someone cares enough to search. The empty quarter is no longer empty. It's full of history, full of stories, full of ruins waiting to be discovered and mysteries waiting to be solved. And somewhere in that vastness, beneath the sand that covers everything, Ubar waits, found and still lost, known and still mysterious, real and still legendary. The city that God destroyed, the Atlantis of the sands, Iram of the pillars. It's all of those things and none of them. It's archaeology and faith, history and myth, fact and legend combined into something that can't be neatly categorized or definitively explained. It's human. And that perhaps is the real lesson of Ubar. Not that we found it or failed to find it, not whether Shisar is the true Ubar or just one possibility among many, but that the search itself reveals who we are. A species that tells stories, builds cities, crosses deserts, destroys what we've created through arrogance or accident, and then, centuries later, digs through the ruins trying to understand what happened and what it means. In the empty quarter, the wind howls, the sand shifts, the ruins endure, and the story continues as it always has, as it always will, for as long as humans exist to wonder about the past and search for answers in the places where civilizations rose and fell and left behind fragments of themselves for us to find. The lost city beneath the desert. It was real, and it was found.